Let's break down 3 running backs and 3 wide receivers that are sneaky starts heading into Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season and go over what quarterbacks and tight ends are the strongest streaming options here in Week 11. Let's kick the video off with Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys, coming off of a performance in Week 10 where he had just 8.6 fantasy points against a good Philadelphia Eagles run defense, just 53 yards on the ground, and added 3 receptions for 3 total receiving yards. So very low ceiling this past week, and obviously we have a drastic change in this Cowboys offense with Cooper Rush as the starting quarterback, and that seems to be the plan here once again in Week 11 in the absence of Dak Prescott. So I think that's probably better than Trey Lance, but only time will tell. What we do know is that there's a lower ceiling at the end of the day for the Cowboys offense, and this is another tough matchup this week as the Houston Texans are giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. But we also have word that according to Cowboys coaching staff that there is no longer any type of committee here for the Dallas Cowboys backfield. It's just Rico Dowdle. He's going to be acting as the RB1 moving forward. No sprinkles of Ezekiel Elliott, not totally surprising. No Dalvin Cook coming out from the practice squad. No Deuce Vaughn. It's just going to be Rico Dowdle. And I think that is a very good thing for fantasy managers who own Rico Dowdle. So if you're going into Week 11, you have running backs on bye week dealing with injuries, whatever it may be, and Dowdle's your only option, or if you're struggling at the flex position, I do think that Rico Dowdle can come through with a solid fantasy performance. And I think also, we only had 1 week for this Cowboys offense to kind of get acclimated to what they were going to be against Philly. It was a tough spot for them, and don't get me wrong, I don't have a lot of faith in this Cowboys offense, but things should at least somewhat smooth out to where we can see decent floors for players like Rico Dowdle, CeeDee Lamb, and Jake Ferguson for the remainder of the fantasy season. The upside is certainly capped, but if you're stuck in a position where you have to start Rico Dowdle this week, I don't think he is the worst start, and I think he could be a sneaky start here in Week 11. Next up, let's talk about Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. We last saw him in action in Week 9 as the Browns had a bye week in Week 10, and he's had 5.2 or less fantasy points in his last 2 starts, and then just 10.2 fantasy points in Week 7, his first start of the season, where he did stumble into the end zone and score a touchdown. On top of that, we have Jerome Ford kind of looming around as well. 2 touches on the ground in Week 9, 3 targets as well in that game, just 1 reception. So I'm not going to say I'm totally concerned about Jerome Ford, but I have heard that come up for Nick Chubb owners. But what we really want to look at here is the matchup. It's a fantastic matchup on the road for the Browns, going up against the Saints, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the running back position. So I actually think that Nick Chubb is a strong flex option this week, a player who should have a solid floor, and a player who could easily see his best fantasy outing so far on the season. And looking at the strength of schedule for the remainder of the season for the Browns, this might be Nick Chubb's best game, period, this entire season. So if you own Nick Chubb, I still think he's a clear-cut RB1 here. Like we said, just 3 total touches for Jerome Ford this past week. Nick Chubb, on the other hand, 16 total touches. So he's still the clear-cut RB1 here. It's a great spot for the running back position. As we know, this Saints defense has just been awful against the run over the past couple of weeks, and as a whole on the season, at this point, giving up the 29th most points to the running back position. So if you own Nick Chubb, don't be afraid to start him this week. I think he is a very solid start and a player that could fill in nicely at the RB2 spot, at the flex spot, if you are hurting here in Week 11. All right, last running back we want to take a look at is Audric Estimé, coming off of a performance in Week 10 against a tough Kansas City Chiefs unit where he had 5.3 fantasy points, 53 yards on the ground, 3.79 yards per carry off of 14 touches. Nothing crazy here. Didn't score. Tough matchup and a not-so-great matchup this week against the Falcons, giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. But what we really want to look at, as much people are aware of at this point in time, is the split with this backfield. And last week, this was all Audric Estimé's backfield. 14 total touches, like we said. Javonte had 1 touch, 2 receptions. Jaleel McLaughlin, just 2 touches on the ground. So do I trust a Sean Payton backfield? I'm not quite sure yet. But Audric Estimé sits at 53% rostered. He was one of the most added players on the waiver wire this past week. But if he's still out there and you're struggling, we could definitely take a chance here and argue the fact that he's going to be an RB1, at least in respect to the Denver Broncos team here in Week 11. So once again, not a fantastic matchup, but this is a home game for the Denver Broncos, and this Atlanta Falcons secondary has really been struggling. So I do expect the pass game for the Broncos to be good, which could, of course, lead to red zone opportunities. So hopefully Audric Estimé gets those red zone opportunities. We don't make a switch at the goal line. Ultimately, this was the RB1 for the Broncos this past week, and the coach speak going into this week was that if he continues to play how he played this past week, then he's going to continue to be the RB1. Once again, we'll see what happens. Sean Payton offense. But if you're in a tough spot, he certainly should give you running back one volume here in Week 11. Moving along to wide receivers, let's talk about Jakobi Meyers, who you might look at your roster and say, well, I kind of think Jakobi Meyers is a start every week, but really looking at questions that we get and rosters that I've seen here on the channel, I don't feel that way about Jakobi Meyers. I feel like he's always kind of one of these players that's hanging on the bench, not too confident to start him, and he's got a tough matchup this week against the Miami Dolphins, giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Now, we did see that Dolphins secondary get a little bit banged up against the Rams this past week, but Jalen Ramsey did not get banged up, and I would assume he's going to see Jakobi Meyers for most of this game. But what's really interesting about Jakobi Meyers is that he's performed well in bad spots. 13.2 fantasy points in Week 5 against the Denver Broncos and Pat Surtain. And then in Week 8, 17.2 fantasy points against the Kansas City Chiefs, one of the best pass defenses in the NFL. Scored a touchdown in that game. In Week 9, the last time we saw him play against the Cincinnati Bengals, not as tough of a matchup, but 18.5 fantasy points and was on bye week this past week. So he's found a way to produce in tough matchups. So I want to say I'm not that worried about Jakobi Meyers, and he's a clear-cut wide receiver one on this team. We know that really the only other threat in terms of a pass catcher on this team is Brock Bowers at tight end, and all this volume goes to Jakobi Meyers since Week 3. 7 or more targets in every game, 9 or more targets in every game except for one. So if you own Jakobi Meyers, if you're looking at this matchup, not so sure if he's going to be a good, viable flex option if you're in a bind this week, I think Jakobi Meyers is definitely a solid start as we move in to Week 11. And one sneaky line I love on Underdog going into Week 11 is Jakobi Meyers' total receptions, currently sitting at 5.5 total receptions. He has hit that in every game he's played in since Week 5, and he's hit that in every game but one since Week 3. We know he's going to get all the volume at the wide receiver position. I think this is a smash line to go ahead and hit on Underdog. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch are going to get a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 11. Take your free Pick'em, take the over on Meyers' total receptions. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 11 that you can pair with a line like Jakobi Meyers' total receptions and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Next up, let's take a look at Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions, a player that I liked last week going up against the Houston Texans secondary. And he made a couple big catches in this game, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 53 receiving yards, but in total just 8.3 fantasy points. And we didn't really see that upside on display as he made his return from that 2-game suspension. But I think he could certainly show that upside against the Jacksonville Jaguars this week, giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So if you're kind of struggling here, you're looking for a home run hit, somebody that you can throw into the flex that brings upside to the table, definitely still brings boomer bust capacity to the table as well. I think Jameson Williams is a solid play. We should see this Lions team get a little bit creative, draw some things up early, score points early, get ahead in this game. And if they don't, If this is a competitive matchup, well, that's okay too, because that means they're going to be throwing the football more against one of the worst secondaries in the entire NFL. So if you're looking for some upside, some sneaky upside, I think Jameson Williams, who is going to be riding a lot of fantasy managers' benches this weekend, could end up being a home run hit and bring a high ceiling to your fantasy lineup here in week 11. All right, last wide receiver I want to mention is Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots. Coming in at 44% roster, this might be a play that you can pick up off of the waiver wire. The Patriots at home this week against the Rams, who are giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. While the Rams have really improved in terms of their front seven, in terms of their run defense, they haven't necessarily improved too much in terms of their pass defense, as we see them giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Demario Douglas in his past 2 games, 9 or more fantasy points. So I do think that Demario Douglas kind of has limited upside. We haven't seen him score a touchdown since week 6 against the Houston Texans. But what we do know is that the Patriots will be throwing the football more with Drake May as the starting quarterback. We've seen that on display in the past couple of weeks. And Demario Douglas going to be a part of the game plan. So I think he's a player, you're kind of, if you're struggling at the flex spot this week, you're looking for somebody just to plug in. He's got a good matchup. I think 10 fantasy points is definitely a doable stat line for Demario Douglas this week. So kind of sucks that we don't see that touchdown upside with Demario Douglas, because I think that could put him over the top here. But 10, 11 fantasy points against this Rams secondary, I think is very realistic. And once again, this is a player that you could potentially pick up off the waiver wire and plug in last minute. So if you need some sneaky upside, I think Demario Douglas could provide that in week 11. All right, very quickly, let's take a look at some streaming options at the quarterback and tight end position. Some of these players have moved up in total roster percentage as the week has progressed and waivers have cleared. But nonetheless, these are players that you should be able to at least have a shot on the waivers of picking up and starting this week if you need help at quarterback and tight end. Let's start with Russell Wilson, who's moved up to 50% rostered, 19 fantasy points in week 10 through 3 touchdowns, a pick, 195 passing yards, and ran the ball 4 times for 3 rushing yards. But what we want to look at is that Russell Wilson has 19 or more fantasy points in 2 of his 3 starts with the Steelers, and really should have had 19 or more fantasy points in week 8 with 2 passing touchdowns of George Pickens being called back against the Giants. Here in week 11, he gets the Baltimore Ravens at home, the team allowing the 31st most fantasy points to the quarterback position. If you need to stream a quarterback this week, I think Russell Wilson is your best option if he's available. Once again, sits at 50% rostered. Fantastic matchup. Very safe floor. Nice upside out of Russ this week as well. Bo Nix is the next guy I want to take a look at, going up against the Atlanta Falcons, giving up the 25th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Bo Nix has been great. We've talked about him for weeks here on the channel. A lot of people now starting to talk about Bo Nix, starting to give him his flowers. But if we date back to week 3 of the season, Bo Nix has 18 or more fantasy points in every game except for 3. And one of those was this past week against the Kansas City Chiefs, where he had 16.1 fantasy points, but still played a very clean game. No turnovers, 22 of 30, 215 passing yards. 2 passing touchdowns, looked really good out there against a great Chiefs defense, was slinging the football. He's the quarterback 9 right now in fantasy. Once again, we're looking at a safe floor here, but some nice upside due to the matchup. If Bo Nix is available, he sits at 56% rostered. I think he's a very strong start, and quite frankly, he's just a quarterback that needs to be rostered in more formats moving forward. And really, all 3 quarterbacks we're taking a look at, I think, need to be rostered in more formats moving forward. Now, Justin Herbert has moved up to 75% rostered, but if he's a player who you have on your active roster and you're contemplating things going into the week, I think he's a very strong start, as the Cincinnati Bengals are giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the quarterback position thus far on the season. He has 19 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, and really since that week 5 bye week, the Chargers since week 6, they've really started to throw the football quite a bit more, which has been really nice to see. We have a passing touchdown or more in 3 straight games, and this past week, where he only threw 1 passing touchdown, he at least ran for a passing touchdown, and then 2 passing touchdowns in both weeks 8 and week 9 for Justin Herbert. Strong matchup here. Primetime game on Sunday Night Football. Home game for the Chargers. Justin Herbert, a strong start this week if you're not so confident in your QB1 or if you're able to pick him up off of the waiver wire. 2 tight ends I would take a look at. Let's start with Hunter Henry, who did start the week as questionable, but he's off of the injury report. A down week in week 10 against the Chicago Bears, one of the best teams in terms of fantasy points allowed to the tight end position. They've been very good against opposing tight ends on the season, but outside of that, every single week that Drake May has been the starting quarterback for the New England Patriots and played a full game, Hunter Henry has double-digit fantasy points. Week 8, the only other week where he did not hit double digits, game we saw Drake May leave early, and Hunter Henry still had 9.5 fantasy points in that game. Great matchup this week against the Rams, giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. He sits at 45% rostered. He's a strong streaming option. But if Pat Freiermuth is out there, I like him even more. He comes in at 51% rostered. I know he only had 3 targets, 3 catches this past week. He did score a touchdown, did have 10.7 fantasy points, but what we really want to look at is the fact that Pat Freiermuth is playing the Baltimore Ravens this week, similar to Russell Wilson, and they are the team allowing the most fantasy points to the tight end position so far on the season. So it's a smash matchup. He's coming off of a good performance in week 10 where he scored a touchdown. I won't be surprised if that boils over into week 11. So there are some streaming options at quarterback and tight end. If you guys need somebody last minute, I think these are the best options here in week 11. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 6 sneaky starts heading into week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season and some streaming options at the quarterback and tight end position. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever as we move into week 11, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. On top of that, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because each and every week we're going to have every single thing that you could possibly need to help you guys dominate each and every week of 2024 fantasy football. So make sure you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.